In this episode, we're going to treat a privacy notice as a user-facing product feature, not as a legal appendix. Because the difference between those two mindsets is the difference between building trust and merely checking a box. Beginners often think a notice is a long page that exists so an organization can say it disclosed something. But users experience notices as signals of honesty, respect, and competence. A clear notice helps people understand what is happening with their data, why it is happening, and what they can actually do about it. And that clarity reduces surprise, complaints, and confusion during moments of stress like incidents or account changes. An honest notice also protects the organization because honesty forces alignment between claims and reality, which is the foundation of accountability. An actionable notice matters because information without control is frustrating, and control without information is manipulative. So the notice must connect understanding to meaningful choices. For the Certified Information Privacy Technologist, CIPT, exam, this is high yield because many scenarios are really about trust and alignment, and the best answer often involves improving how people are informed and how choices are enforced. By the end, you should be able to describe what makes a notice clear, what makes it honest, what makes it actionable, and how to design notices that remain accurate as systems evolve. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong privacy notice begins with clarity about audience, because the notice is usually read by people who do not share your technical vocabulary and who are often trying to complete a task quickly. Clarity means using plain language, avoiding vague phrases that sound like permission slips, and structuring information so a person can find what matters without hunting. It also means describing data categories and uses in a way that matches how users think about the product, not how the backend names tables or events. For example, users understand that a service may collect contact details, location, and usage activity, but they don't benefit from a list of internal identifiers unless you explain what those identifiers represent in human terms. Clarity also includes being specific about purposes, because the difference between providing a feature and building marketing profiles is a difference users care about, and the notice should not blur those together. A beginner misunderstanding is that long equals clear, but length can hide important meaning. So clear notices often prioritize relevance and precision over volume. When a notice is clear, it reduces the cognitive burden on users and makes the organization's behavior easier to evaluate. Honesty in privacy notices is not just about avoiding lies, because many notices are technically true while still being misleading. A notice can be misleading when it uses broad language that hides sensitive uses, when it buries key facts in dense sections, or when it describes choices as if they exist while making those choices difficult to exercise. Honest notices make the most important facts easy to understand, especially facts that would change a user's decision, such as whether data is shared with third parties, whether data is used for targeted advertising, whether sensitive inferences are made, and how long data is kept. Honesty also means avoiding the temptation to promise things you cannot enforce, like claiming you never share data when you rely on vendors, or claiming you delete everything immediately when backups and logs persist. In practice, honesty requires a strong internal model of data flows, because you cannot communicate truthfully about processing you do not understand. This is why privacy notices are closely tied to inventories, records of processing, and change management, even though users never see those internal artifacts. For the exam, a key skill is recognizing when a notice is likely to be misleading and what operational changes would be needed to make it truthful. Actionable notices connect information to choice and to user rights in a way that is practical rather than ceremonial. Actionability means that when you tell a user something, you also tell them what they can do about it, such as how to control a setting, how to opt out of optional processing, how to access or delete data, and how to contact support in a predictable way. It also means that these options are actually effective, because a notice that points to a control that doesn't work is worse than a notice that admits the limitation. Actionability requires clear instructions that are not hidden behind complicated steps, and it requires that the organization's systems enforce choices across data flows, which is why consent journeys and preference propagation matter. Another aspect of actionability is setting expectations about timelines, like how long requests take or how long data is retained, because users need realistic expectations to plan their behavior. Beginners sometimes think actionability is merely listing rights, but listing rights without a usable pathway is not helpful. On the exam, answers that strengthen the connection between what is stated and what can be done tend to reflect mature privacy practice. A practical way to craft notices is to think of them as answers to the user's natural questions, because users tend to come to notices with a small set of concerns. They want to know what you collect, why you collect it, how you use it, who gets it, how long you keep it, how you protect it, and what control they have. They also want to know what happens when things change, such as when a feature is updated or a new sharing partner is added. If your notice answers these questions directly, users feel respected and trust grows. If your notice answers them indirectly with vague statements, users feel like you are hiding something, even if you are not. This is where structure matters, because a notice should help people locate the answers quickly, and it should use consistent terminology so users can connect sections. Structure also supports internal alignment, because teams can map their processing descriptions to clear notice sections instead of writing ad hoc language. The goal is not to overwhelm users with every possible detail, but to give them enough truth to make informed decisions. For exam scenarios, the best notice improvements often involve making these answers more concrete and less evasive. Notices also have to handle the tricky problem of describing data categories accurately without creating confusion. Users tend to understand broad categories like account information, payment information, location, and usage activity, but privacy programs often track data at a much finer grain. The notice needs to communicate categories at the right level so users can understand what is happening, while still being accurate enough to avoid misleading omissions. For example, if a product collects precise location, calling it location may be too vague, because precise location has different risk implications than approximate location. If a product collects content a user types, calling it usage information may be misleading, because content can be far more sensitive than simple interaction metrics. Honesty requires naming sensitive categories in a way that signals importance without becoming sensational. It also requires describing whether data is collected directly from the user, observed through use, inferred from behavior, or received from third parties, because people often care about the source of information. Beginners sometimes forget that inference is a form of data, but inferences can shape decisions and experiences, so users deserve clarity about that. Exam questions about notices often hinge on whether the notice reflects the real nature of the data being processed. Purpose statements are another area where clear, honest notices matter, because purpose is the bridge between collection and use. A purpose statement should explain what the organization is trying to achieve with the data in a way that makes sense to a user, and it should avoid the trap of being so broad that it effectively permits anything. Overly broad purposes create two problems. Users cannot meaningfully evaluate them, and internal teams treat them as permission to expand processing without review. A clear purpose statement ties data used to specific outcomes, like delivering a service, preventing fraud, improving reliability, or providing optional personalization. It also distinguishes necessary purposes from optional purposes, which supports meaningful choice, because users deserve to know what they can opt out of without breaking core functionality. For example, personalization might be optional, while security monitoring might be necessary, and a notice should not blur those together. When purposes are clear, it becomes easier to align data flows with promises and easier to detect drift when processing expands. On the exam, choices that refine purpose statements and tie them to enforceable boundaries often reflect the most mature response. Third-party sharing is one of the most sensitive notice topics because it is a common source of user surprise and regulatory attention. A clear and honest notice should describe what kinds of third parties receive data, why they receive it, and what general constraints apply, such as whether the third party can use the data only to provide services or can use it for its own purposes. Users also care about whether sharing supports the service they are using or whether it supports broader advertising and profiling ecosystems. A notice does not need to list every vendor name in every context, to be honest, but it does need to avoid hiding the nature of sharing behind vague terms like trusted partners. It should also reflect whether users have choices about certain sharing, and those choices must be meaningful and enforced. Another key point is that third-party sharing changes over time, so notice maintenance requires vendor inventory and change triggers that prompt updates. Beginners sometimes assume sharing is static, but in cloud environments, vendors and integrations change frequently, and notices must keep up. Exam scenarios that involve hidden sharing often reward answers that increase specificity, improve choice, and strengthen internal processes so sharing descriptions stay accurate. Retention and deletion are also crucial notice elements, because time boundaries are part of what users reasonably expect, and endless retention is often experienced as invasive. A notice should explain how long data is kept in terms that are understandable, like keeping certain records for a defined time for security, legal, or operational reasons, and it should avoid implying that data disappears instantly when it does not. Honesty requires acknowledging that some data may persist in backups for a limited period or that some records must be retained for legal obligations, while still explaining what controls exist to limit use during that period. Actionability requires explaining what users can do, like closing an account, deleting content, or requesting deletion, and what the realistic outcome will be. Retention statements that are overly vague, like "we keep data as long as necessary," may be technically true but not very helpful, and they can feel evasive. A privacy technologist should advise teams to define retention by data category and purpose, and then communicate those categories in a way users can understand. This also supports system design, because clear retention commitments create engineering requirements that can be implemented and tested. Exam questions that involve retention often reward answers that connect notice language to enforceable lifecycle controls. Security and safeguards are often described in notices, but they should be handled carefully to avoid false reassurance. Users benefit from knowing that an organization uses appropriate safeguards, but vague claims like "we use industry-standard security" can be both unhelpful and risky if they create an impression of absolute safety. An honest notice focuses on the types of safeguards in a general sense, like access controls, encryption, and monitoring, without turning the notice into a technical manual. It also avoids promising that breaches will never happen, because that is unrealistic and can damage trust when incidents occur. Actionability can include telling users how they can protect themselves, such as using strong authentication settings, but notices should avoid shifting responsibility onto users for organizational failures. A privacy technologist should also remember that describing security measures can create attack interest if details are too specific, so the notice should balance transparency with sensible restraint. The exam will not usually ask you to write security pros, but it can test whether you understand that notices must be accurate and not overstated. Choosing an answer that avoids overpromising and focuses on truthful safeguards often reflects mature thinking. Notices also need to support change communication, because a notice that is accurate today can become misleading tomorrow if processing changes and the notice is not updated. Change communication is part of honesty because users form expectations based on what they were told, and when the organization changes the rules, users deserve a fair chance to understand and respond. A mature approach includes internal triggers that identify when a change is material, such as introducing a new data category, expanding sharing, introducing new profiling, or altering retention. When a material change occurs, the organization should update the notice and consider whether additional user-facing communication is needed in the product experience, so users are not surprised. This is where notice management becomes part of privacy operations, because it depends on change intake, review, and documentation, not on occasional policy updates. Beginners sometimes assume updating a notice is a simple publishing task, but in reality, it requires validating that the new statements match actual data flows, and that controls exist to support what is promised. On the exam, scenarios involving surprise often have root causes in poor change communication and weak operational alignment, and the best answer typically strengthens that alignment. A common pitfall when crafting notices is writing from the organization's perspective rather than the user's perspective, which leads to defensive language that feels evasive. Users don't want to be reassured in vague terms. They want to be respected with clear information and real choices. Another pitfall is mixing necessary processing with optional processing, which makes users feel coerced because they can't tell what they must accept and what they can decline. Another pitfall is describing rights and controls without providing practical steps, which makes the notice feel performative. There is also a pitfall of inconsistency, where a notice says one thing, but support documents or setting screens imply another, creating confusion and distrust. A privacy technologist should treat these pitfalls as design problems because they can be corrected through better structure, clearer language, and better alignment between systems and messaging. When you can identify these pitfalls in a scenario, you can propose fixes that are actionable, like revising language to be specific, creating a clear settings pathway, and ensuring preference enforcement. The exam often rewards this practical diagnosis because it shows you can improve trust, not just talk about it. To keep this exam ready, you can evaluate any privacy notice using a simple but thoughtful set of questions that guides you toward clear, honest, actionable improvements. Ask whether a user could quickly understand what data is collected and why, without needing to decode vague phrasing. Ask whether the notice accurately reflects real processing, including third-party sharing, inference, and retention, and whether it avoids promises the system cannot keep. Ask whether the notice connects to meaningful user controls, including settings, opt-outs, and request pathways, and whether it explains consequences in plain language. Ask whether it distinguishes necessary processing from optional processing so users can make real choices. Ask whether it is maintained through operational triggers so it stays accurate as the system changes, and whether terminology is consistent across user-facing materials. Finally, ask whether the notice reduces surprise by communicating key facts where they matter most, not only in a hidden document. When you can run these questions, you can select the best answer in notice-related scenarios because you know what maturity looks like. When you can craft clear, honest, and actionable privacy notices, you are building one of the most important trust interfaces between people and the systems that process their data. For the Certified Information Privacy Technologist, CIPT, exam, this topic matters because notices are where transparency becomes real, and transparency is inseparable from meaningful choice and accountable processing. Clear notices speak in human language and match user mental models. Honest notices align with actual data flows and avoid misleading omissions, and actionable notices connect information to control through enforceable settings and reliable request workflows. Notice quality is not only a writing challenge. It is a systems challenge because accuracy depends on inventories, change management, and control enforcement across complex environments. If you treat notices as living product artifacts supported by strong operations, you reduce surprise, reduce complaints, and reduce long-term risk because your organization stops promising things it cannot deliver. Most importantly, you help users understand and choose, which is the core of privacy-respecting technology design and the kind of integrated thinking the CIPT exam is designed to measure.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.